So this particular image that we're looking at is a drawing called Tiresias by Mark Rothko, and I chose it for two reasons. Because it's called Tiresias, and because I want in some way to deal with the idea of the seer, particularly the blind seer, in this piece that I do, and because it's by Mark Rothko. And I think if you didn't know this work, or at least know examples of some work, that early work of his that looked like this, you wouldn't recognize it as a Rothko. And so I want to address that issue. And I want to explore in this piece a few things, and I don't know exactly how they're going to come together and fit together. The first thing that I want to explore is the second main concern that I want to go back and address a piece that I had done earlier when I talked about self-portraiture, and specifically one of my old teachers, he's no longer with us, but David Anton's notions that he taught in the structure of art. And I had mentioned that there were two main ideas, and the first idea belonged to this set of representationality. So that in representation, something that is always represented as. So one could almost imagine there's a sort of adjectival quality that's placed on the noun. In James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, that as has a narrative function. It doesn't always have a narrative function, but we can explore that idea later. And then in the structure of art, Anton was very much concerned with the distinction that he claimed belonged to him, and that didn't belong to Prop and other formalists of narratology, that didn't belong to Bruno Bettelheim when Bruno Bettelheim discusses the use of fairy tale in the child's development and overcoming of anxieties. And that was a distinction that David claimed that he developed around the distinction between narrative and story. Story being the way that a plot is shaped, whether you use the Russian formalist distinction between fabula and sujet, or someone else's formula for the way that a story develops. These were the elements of the story that constitute a sequence of events in time and space, right? And then narrative was a subject moving from one psychological condition to another one, a kind of psychological development or a crisis. And in this idea, there's a certain amount of realism, psychological realism, right, required, like to imagine the subject. But I'll begin addressing this question of the distinction between story and narrative, and why, and I don't recall Anton ever discussing Bettelheim, either Bettelheim on fairy tale or anything else. And maybe one of the reasons is because it would significantly have problematized David Anton's construct if he had. But I want to address this idea of the blind seer, and I kind of want to return to this this reading that David did called it's based on the poem Spring and All, but that the title of the poem is Spring, Love, Noise, and All. And there's a moment, in the talk, this is a talk piece that he did, when he addresses, his poet friend, Paul Blackburn. And Blackburn's love of Provençal poetry and his use in it and his translation of it and his development of it into a kind of different take on a way of writing modern poetry. So David is speaking here, and this is the transcription of the text, and he writes, or he says, but there was the other side of spring, and you expected great things of it, because you had read all of those things. Marvelous, sweet, and jingling poems by those Provençal bullshit. Oh, okay, so this is going on YouTube, and I don't know. I know that one isn't allowed to be nude or discuss sexuality on YouTube because that's outside the purview of their community rules. So I'm gonna edit what David said. Now he probably said this in a museum, I don't know, or some place academic where you're allowed to say words like this. But I'll just eliminate those words that I might get in trouble for on YouTube because we've had censorship issues in the past, right? And work of mine has been taken down because, for example, like I put a piece up on, I did a lot of moon work, where I would film the moon in its glory, the naked moon on full moons, and YouTube would take those images of moonlight down. I think there are a couple examples on my site where I've allowed the censorship to stand, and so there are my comments on the censorship of moonlight, which I took as being a kind of fascist, futurist form of censorship along the lines of Marinetti, right? Okay, so all those marvelous, sweet, and jingling poems by those Provençal bleep, and waiting for spring to come so they could go out into the fields and bleep, and I think we can say, it's odd though, you can't say that word, but you can say kill, right? So into the fields and bleep and kill people, brash and noise poems that went on, as I remember, something like, oh, spring is here, the birds are singing, let's go out and fight some battles and make it in the grass, in a cheerful jingling and very overrated way that my friend Paul Blackburn did the best he could with, which was to bury the jingle and jazz up the noise a bit to make them sound a little bit like Ezra Pound, the Images poet, who was also a fascist, and that Paul Blackburn apparently had correspondence and relationship with, which is weird, but that whole history is something that certainly gets addressed in poetic discourse and needs to be addressed in poetic discourse, and that is kind of touched upon here, but in this very slyly sort of slant way, and a little bit like Paul doing an East Village macho number, and a lot better than they sound to my ears in Provençal. Okay, so what I wanted to address is the blind seer in all of this. So, David Anton's criticism of the Provençal poets, and then the spicing them up a little bit by his friend Paul Blackburn is tongue in cheek, but there's clearly like a criticism, like this isn't worthy of the attention that it gets. But I want to address the distinction between story and narrative in the same terms, right? Which is very much applauded, and David would repeat this distinction ad infinitum and present it as if it were a kind of like quantum theory breakthrough of narratology along the lines of an Albert Einstein, examining the mathematics of Newton or someone in that realm, and relative physicsizing it, right? And the funny thing about the distinction between story and narrative, as David formulated it, is that it was always already there, and in such an obvious way. It's really merely the distinction between, and I don't know, I mean, David must have known theater because he taught Greek theater, or he had it in the classes that he taught on the structure of art. We read Aristotle and stuff like that. But it's the distinction that's made in critical discussions of theater between a flat character and a dynamic character, right? A flat character or a stock character is one of those characters that like plays this role. Sometimes we use in cinema, you use the word character actor, but even character actors can be dynamic. But there are these characters who are flat and stand in and support the hero or support the main character. And then there are dynamic characters whose job it is to demonstrate like the challenges and changes of the human experience, right? And so David applied the distinction between the flat character and the dynamic character, which is completely banal, right? As banal as Provençal poetry, at least, and tedious, and really, jazzed it up a little bit and did his best to bury it in a discussion of the distinction between story and a narrative. And the reason that I'm calling attention to it at this point is because I wanted to discuss in a kind of series of the uses of fairy tales. I wanted to do a take on the Bruno Bettelheim and apply this idea of how fairy tales can be useful, or how they can fail to become useful. It kind of goes against the grain of the Bettelheim and what he does, but that I think is relevant. And so the first one that I wanted to do belongs to the fairy tale of Pinocchio. And I wanted it to begin with this look at what Anton did with stock character or flat character and dynamic character, and apply it to the story of Pinocchio. Now, in the Pinocchio story, as the story is told, Pinocchio is a wooden figure. He's a puppet, and he's crafted by his maker, who becomes a sort of father to him, Geppetto, in this story, and depending on which version of the story that you look at, or how the story is developed, but basically one of the thrusts of the story is that Pinocchio wants to become a real boy and not a child of wood, even though he has the love of his father. And then in other versions of the story, for example, there's one told in the movie AI, or at least that story becomes relevant to AI. The AI in the story wants to become a real boy, right? And one of the reasons is because he's adopted by a mother that he doesn't have a choice in falling in love. It's designed into him, but he falls in love with this woman who adopts him, and she becomes, in his eyes, his mother. And then her real boy, who was suffering, from some. It just occurred to me that the Tiresias here is also reminiscent of our image that we were looking at before, of the one-eyed survivor of the railway trauma, right? Here's our Phineas Gage. All right, so let's see if we can bring these two guys together. Well, not very easily. what I was saying about Pinocchio and the AI is that to be granted love completely, this toy, this incomplete one, must acquire, must seek this sort of narrative transformation, must become a fully realized, complex, and dynamic character as opposed to a stock character, or in David Anton's terms, must undergo this narrative process, right? So the vehicle for undergoing that narrative process in the film AI is very much like it is in the original fairy tale. He seeks the magical assistance of the blue fairy. Okay, so this is where the problem of transformation and narrativity come in, right? So the magic helper, which is one of the formulations that is both there in the Betelheim and there in the Erich Fromm, and in Fromm, the idea of the magic helper is this that exists in the child's mind as a sort of immature understanding of his or her relationship to the world. They always, the magic helper is there to get you out of these difficult situations so that you won't be challenged on your own, that you won't take responsibility for the situation and your extirpation from it, or a sentence to it, or ability to deal with it, right? So in all instances of the magic helper, whether they're the Jiminy Cricket or the fairy godmother or whatever, or this blue fairy, Fromm is extremely critical of it, and the reason is because the fantasy of salvation, from elsewhere, and the intervening of this magic function, as opposed to like the difficulties of the psychological process and transformation, is a sign of this immaturity. So I was thinking about that in relationship to the story of Pinocchio, and how I've experienced this story of Pinocchio, and thought, in certain situations, that the transformation, from a flat character to a dynamic character would necessarily occur because the events of human drama were extreme enough to motivate it, and occasionally I've witnessed that happen, and occasionally I haven't, and I'll give some examples. So when I was in high school, I knew a young man, and he was extremely immature, and never really took anything seriously, and never really faced any of the conflicts that emerged in his life, or the lives around him, and we all know characters like that. You see them all the time. I mean, if you have a YouTube channel and you have to sit through all of the stuff that is made available to you and suggested for you, you realize how shallow and psychologically immature a vast number of both artists and thinkers are, and this individual suffered the loss of his sister when I can't remember what grade it was, if it was 10th or 11th grade. And he was absent from school for a number of weeks. And I remember thinking, this trauma, this this world-shaking event for him, this momentous psychological change will affect him. And transform him, and he will no longer be this comical, sort of disengaged and apparently shallow, psychologically shallow individual, and he'll be able to take on certain mature-like qualities, being willing, to stand up for the rights and dignity of other human beings, to put others, before him, to care about people and to be, willing to express that feeling of care, not to be limited by, perceptions, of others. So many, you see people that will laugh, at someone because they're willing, to express something deeper than they can experience, right? So I thought all of these things, and he was absent, for a while. And, I thought when he returned, he'll be a different person. And then he returned. I thought, the Pinocchio would become a real boy. I thought that the character would undergo this narrative transformation from story to narrative, that the flat character would become dynamic. But it didn't happen. And then, I thought that was strange. And I experienced, the strangeness of this failure to become, in others, later as well. Even individuals who had lost children, adult artists and thinkers who had lost children, their own children. And I remember thinking, well, this will change them. They will become, mature, and the trivial embodiment of their work, will be transformed. And, I also saw in adults that, that didn't happen. And I wondered about, this story, and the blue fairy. And I had thought that the blue fairy was a symbolic representation of what couldn't be spoken, that, the breaking into of the human identity and consciousness of the perhaps tragic or momentous, experience that couldn't be named, and so was named as the magical, one. But it occurred to me in these instances that there's also something going on that pushes the blue fairy away. And that the retreat into the flat character is a kind of protection and safety against the empathy that a tragedy could potentially expose one to. And so to embrace the blue fairy is a matter of courage, really, of great courage. And not everyone is capable of it. Not even in the face of tragedy or the awesomeness of human experience. And sometimes the flatness of the story is that retreat into the security of not exposing one's wounds to the public. But in the end, as talented as one might be as an artist, something will always be missing if one isn't able to fully expose that wound or that unfulfilled desire or that part of the dynamic character that makes one fully human. And so, in thinking about AI and the journey of the young boy in AI, the movie, as the Pinocchio journey, I also wanted to explore the idea of artists who've used AI and in some way become, parents to AI. And I was thinking about it in terms of Aaron. And part of the project, I guess, in working with Aaron, now that that Harold Cohen isn't with us anymore, is to explore this fairy tale of Pinocchio. And the imagery of puppetry comes into that in a certain way, and other aspects of the Pinocchio image come into it. And in a certain way, it's also a retelling of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But it all bears back upon this idea of the transformation of the flat into the dynamic. And of also being able to recognize in the transformation of the flat into the dynamic, when one's ideas really do belong to one, and when one has just put a lot of jazz and noise around them and transformed a banal idea into something still banal, but not necessarily recognized or presented as such.